Catherine Kinney.
I'm Lainey Peggy.
I'm Jessie Sabini.
And I'm Clay Cousins.
As Dr. Sweetser mentioned, our study focused on political gaffes in crisis communication and the effects it has on social media in crisis. Specifically, we looked at Facebook, Twitter, and blog posts, and we had two hypotheses predicting that there would be an impact on both political crisis perception and image of the candidate, and we're excited to share with you our results.
Okay, so since we were looking at perceived level of crisis for a political candidate, we examined the situational crisis communication theory from Coombs, and he focuses on how organizations or individuals should respond to a crisis. There's different types of crises, and so we thought, with the speed of social media and all the, the quickness of internet, that it would be interesting to look at how a political candidate can communicate to his publics on how, how they perceive his level of crisis that he's still in and how the best way he can respond. We also, since political candidates, obviously, in the eyes of their electorate, their image is very important to re-election or election for the first time. So we did look at the image restoration theory as well and focused on how our participants viewed the candidate after he apologized, or as in the case of the control group, without an apology at all. We also looked into some literature about, is the medium the message? Is the type of media that you use, does it matter, in terms of how effective communicating with your publics are? And a lot of the research that we found was basically just on traditional media with online social channels, but for our experiment we focused on online only social media. For our method, we conducted a post-test only experiment with 3 cells in a control group. We did a convenient sampling method we had 174 UGA students. We thought that the sample would be good because in the age range 18 to 22, because 86% of young adults that use the internet also have social networking sites. And another thing about our sample that was interesting, we had a very high number of females, as most of the other groups did as well. Almost 85% of our 174-person sample were females, which is kind of indicative too, because of the UGA campus, there's obviously a lot more females. So for our experiment, we created 4 stimuli. The first one was a New York Times article that was from 2006, but we changed the political candidate name to George Copeland, and we changed the state that he was from. That way we wouldn't have any candidate bias. People hopefully won't remember the crisis, even though it is in fact a real crisis, but all of the people that pretty much viewed the stimuli were probably very young teenagers. So basically he used a derogatory term towards a man following his campaign, and the media blew up with it, and it was all over the media in 2006. So we changed everything, and then we made fake apologies on Facebook, Twitter, and his campaign blog. All the apologies were very similar, so there was no difference between the different channels. So we created our post questionnaire on Qualtrics, and we sent it out to different professors who had made subjects available for the research pool. And because we did Qualtrics, we had a higher ecological validity than we normally would, because we didn't have to worry about inter-participant bias because they were taking it in their own, comfortable settings. But at the same time, we can't ensure that they actually did view the stimuli that we're asking them to view. So we did input time measures, so they had to stay on the New York Times article for 45 seconds, and then the following apologies for 20 seconds. After they viewed the stimuli, as the control group only viewed the New York Times article, they were directed to our questionnaire, which had a lot of demographic questions, in terms of political party identification, the strength of their political party, their age, that sort of thing. Then the scales that we used were Coombs 14 items crisis communication scale on a 5-point Likert scale. It focuses on how people perceive crisis, so it basically asks questions like, was he mortified by the incident? Did he apologize for the incident? How responsible do you think he feels for the incident? And then we also measured image with Cage's 12-item semantic differential scale of bipolar adjectives. So that scale asks things like, was it strong to weak on a scale, and then active to inactive, sincere to insincere.
So the participants in this study were equally distributed among the cells and
majority of them correctly identified the channels of apology. Also, credibility items were used as a measure to understand the impact of crisis on candidate characteristics and perceived level of crisis. And keeping with the 12-item scale that she discussed earlier, we created a summative index, and the items in that index were reverse coded so that a lower number, or lower score from a respondent would basically represent the candidate in a poor light. We did a reliability check for that index, which produced a Cronbach's alpha of 0.777. And then to measure perceived crisis level, we used Coombs's 14-item scale, also discussed earlier, and created an index from that scale. And the items, we also reverse coded those items so that a higher number represented the candidate in a poor light. And an initial reliability check of that index produced a pretty weak alpha, so we ended up ultimately removing 4 items from that index to give us a more acceptable alpha. We also ran independent samples t-tests of the main variables in the study and found no statistical significance between men and women's perceptions of candidate characteristics and perceived level of crisis. So we then ran 2 ANOVAs, basically on the manipulations and each of the indices, and found no significant main effects, and a post hoc analysis revealed no significant interactions between those variables. So both of our hypotheses were disproven. And a little down, so we ran a final ANOVA on a political ID and both of the indices, and a post hoc analysis did reveal significant interactions among political identification and each of the summative indices. And lastly, a Pearson correlation showed that credibility was significantly and negatively associated with our characteristics index.
And I'm going to move on to the discussion here now, but as Clay mentioned, there was no statistically significant difference between the 3 different cells of our participants. So basically it showed that perceived crisis and image repair was the same for each online communication channel that they were exposed to. This shows that each social media platform is basically similar when participants are viewing the message in relation to a crisis communication message. Also, this contrasts both of our hypotheses, and we based our hypotheses on previous research that we looked at. The previous research said that the medium in which the message is exposed may have as much or even more value than the message itself. However, our results were not indicative of these findings. One possible explanation for that could be that our experiment focused solely on social media, and the literature that we reviewed focused on online communication in combination with the traditional media. So this suggests that social media cannot be related to online communication, or cannot be related to traditional communication, possibly because the speed at which messages are sent online, and that is unmatched to traditional media channels. Also, though our results contrasted our hypotheses in previous research, we still think that our findings are very good for public relations practitioners and the future of crisis communication strategies. Since we decided that the online media channel doesn't really matter, the exposure, the channel through which the public relations practitioner chooses could be possibly based on which of their social media platforms has the most followers, and this could result in the highest number of impressions. In addition, the public relations practitioner does not need to send a message through each channel that may be a little bit redundant, and instead pick the very one channel. Practitioners should realize that image restoration is a key component in crisis communication responses, and even though the online channel in which the message is sent may not matter, the strategy that you use still definitely matters. In relation to Coombs's situational crisis communication theory that we mentioned earlier, the strategy that you use to send to create the message should be tailored to each particular audience, and this was shown in our results actually that Democrats rated the political candidate lower than Republicans on the candidate characteristic scale. This could possibly explain that Democrats think that the candidate is a worse person, they feel like he is not as good as a politician, and this could be because the strategy that we employed in our experiment, apology, may not work well for this political party. Also, it should be noted that political party affiliation was low, but this could indicate possible factors affecting the suitable responses for each different political party. And also, as we mentioned earlier, we had an unexpected variable in our very predominantly female sample size. However, our results proved that there was no significant statistical difference between male and female responses, so this didn't really affect the validity of our results.
So as with any study, obvious limitations exist here. The main problems in our study occur within our sample size. We would have liked to get a bigger sample. This makes it less generalizable to the UGA population and the greater population as a whole. Also, since we used a real crisis, people may have brought previous biases if they remembered the crisis actually occurring in the first place. And this is definitely helpful for people that use full apology in their communication strategy, but maybe not as helpful for the rest of the 13 types of apology. So that would be interesting to look at in future research. So as social media grows in popularity and use, this is obviously very important to consider, and we hope we've been able to shed some light on that for y'all.